Here they come.
Howdy.
Oh, Dell, looks like you're in the desert. You've traveled a long way since I saw you this morning here in Houston.
I'm sorry I missed this morning.
Crystals.
That picture was taken in March of 18 on the shoulder of I-10 in Arizona.
Oh, so this is your own photo. Accuracy. Okay, just waiting for folks. Man, people really want to learn about sex work. Hello, everybody. Waiting for some more friends, as I would say in my kids' class. Waiting for friends. Looking for some. Hello there. Hello. The chat. I love the chat. Non folks, seeing lots of names. Jennifer, you're in charge, so you're the one who says. Should I wait?
I say go.
Okay. Whatever Jennifer tells me, all things. Yeah, that's true. You don't have to. No one has to turn the camera on or off. Not like this isn't school. But hi, everybody. Good to see you. Hello. I want to make myself. Okay. Yeah. Welcome to my monthly class of stuff you didn't learn in Hebrew school. Because when Jennifer said that I have to teach every single month, and I said, I'm happy to do that. And she said, okay, so what's your theme and what's your, I'm like, I'm not going to teach one topic all year. That sounds very boring. So the only way I agreed to do is if I could teach whatever I want, specifically things that you didn't learn in Hebrew school, because that's what's most interesting to me. So we cover topics that you probably didn't cover in Hebrew school, including today's topic, which is sex work, specifically. And so, yeah, let's jump in. I'm going to do that, share my screen so you can see all my beautiful. Nope. Oh God, I can't see. Can't see. There we go. And here we go. Oh, and it's all romantic looking too. Again, because it's not school, I'm not gonna like call on you. And if you have something you want to say or a question, wait till I'm done reading the slide, or whoever's reading is done reading the slide, and then happy to have people comment and question and such things. You can put in the chat. I'll probably see that because it's kind of up here on my screen. Or you can raise your hand, or you can just unmute yourself and be like, hey, I have a question, and et cetera, et cetera. So I was nice seeing some people I haven't seen in so long. This is fun. Cool. So Judaism and sex work, stuff you never learned in Hebrew school. I don't think you did. I certainly didn't. As a reminder, because I can't see everybody who's here, and I'm pretty sure I know everyone by name, but just in case, this is a class for those who are 18 and over. If you are not 18 or over and you're on this, you shouldn't be. And if you're a parent who's listening with your kid, that's on you. Okay. It's not, because some people do listen with their kids, which is fine, but just so you know, like this is you put the adults at adult learning tonight. So, oh no. We're going to start in Torah. For those of you who are kind of new to my style, I'd like to kind of try and go quasi-chronological orders. We start in Torah and kind of build up through. And I really try and focus on kind of more the ancient, Torah, Talmud, the Shulchan Aruch today. Yeah, Torah and Talmud folks, more than kind of anyone modern. But we will kind of briefly touch on Israel, modern Israel, because it's just interesting to do. First of all, there are not one, but two categories of sex workers in the Torah. Just the Torah itself has two different categories, two different kinds of sex workers. Now, what they have to say about them You'll see. I'm just going to read for the first part. First, we have a zonah. You see in Leviticus, saying this rule for all people: do not degrade, that's the term, your daughter and make her a zonah, and do not let the land fall into znut and the land be filled with zima. Okay, a lot of terms here, but so we know, at least at the very least, there is one term for a sex worker, and that is zonah. Okay, we don't know much more about it, but we know it's zonah. And we don't want the land to fall into znut. So it's kind of like whatever quality is it that makes a zonah, and different from any other category of sex worker and any other category of person who just has sex. But there's a quality to zonah that is, we don't, the Torah says that's not a quality we want in the land. There's something about that we don't like. And the land be filled with zima. Zima, even though it sounds like zonah, is not the same word. Bookmark that, because we're going to come back to that a little bit later. What else do we know about the zonah? Well, we have a rule. The Kohanim, this is coming in the bottom of the second text, it comes from Leviticus a little bit later on, have always rules for Kohanim, the priestly class. And there's rules about who they can marry, who they can't. The Kohanim shall not take for a wife a woman defiled by, or seeing that word, by znut, nor shall they take one divorced from her husband, for they, these men, are holy to their God. Okay, so just that first sentence, there's two different sentences. There's something about a woman who has engaged in znut, is zonah, and a woman who has been married before and is now divorced. There's something about that the Torah says they are not fitting spouses for a Kohen. Notice, does it say they're not fitting spouses for anybody? Doesn't say that. It says if you're a Kohen, you can't marry a zonah, and you cannot marry a divorced woman, because there's something that now, who is kind of not included, you think might be, because what might you think is the through line? What might you think is the common thing that these two status types of women, a zonah and a divorcee, have in common that would preclude her from being married to a Kohen? What might you think? You can unmute yourself and just say.
Hi. But there's probably a man who's still thinking about that woman.
Okay.
Neither one is a virgin.
Right, you would think that, right, because they're not virgins, and you say, okay, a Kohen has to marry someone who's a virgin, who's never, been with this no other man's ever been there. And so that would preclude a zonah and include a divorcee. But then who else should be included in that?
Widows.
So there's got to be something else at play. Second sentence, we're continuing on with the rules specifically regarding Kohanim, and in this case, a bat Kohen. When the daughter of a Kohen is defiled, so they're definitely connecting that word, through znut, I didn't italicize that, oops, it is her father whom she defiles. And what's the punishment?
Death by fire.
Death by fire. So there's a lot going on here in this sentence. So they're talking, there's a woman whose father is a Kohen, so she is a bat Kohen, the daughter of a Kohen, and she engages in znut. Who has she harmed according to the Torah? Who is the Torah's concerned with in this equation?
The man, of course, the father.
Her father. She's done something to her father. And what is the punishment?
Fire.
Death
Death
by fire, sreifa. Death by fire. Which is, if you just think about the things that are capital punishment in Judaism, it's like murder, like there's a very small number of things that we have engaged in capital punishment for, but something about znut, specifically regarding the daughters of the Kohanim, Torah has a lot of feelings on.
And sorry, put to the fire, does that always mean actually like killed at the fire, or just?
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, it means like, yeah. Good question. Yeah, no, it's, yeah. Good question. That's definitely death by fire. Usually when you think about capital punishment in ancient Judaism, it was stoned to death, which is really just crushed by a giant stone. But there is also sreifa, which is being burnt.
Rabbi?
Yes.
I don't want to belabor it, but I'm already confused with terminology.
Uh-huh.
So if I may ask some 3 brief questions.
Please.
There is a zonah, which
Yes.
I believe is someone who is paid to have sex.
Indeed.
A Zanut, which is a quality to the land where Zonaim live, and the land would be filled with Zima. I don't think I really get what those terms mean.
Right.
I
No,
thought I
those are-
did when you first used them, but then in the context of the paragraph below, it doesn't make sense to me. So can you review those real quickly?
Znut it's not a quality of land. It's more just if I don't like using English translations because I feel like they're all weighted in our minds already because of we speak English. Most of us to some degree or another. And so you're going to think of it, it's going to be weighted positively or negative connotations. But when we think about like a zona is a woman who is paid for sex. There are other categories of women who are paid for sex or people who are paid for sex. Actually, we're going to get to that in literally a moment. But a zona is a woman who's paid for sex, but a specific kind of sex. And the quality of that sex is znut, I guess is the easiest way to say it. That it's kind of, we're going to explain it kind of as we go, and I think it'll make more sense. Like, because I'm trying to show you how like zona and the quality of zona being like znut is introduced. We're going to kind of see how that evolves, and also how what the Torah thinks about that person and that quality, and what the Talmud thinks about the person and that quality kind of get turned around. So we're starting. You don't have to understand it right now. We're just starting. So you have zona is the person. Znut is the kind of sex that this person engages in. Zima is something that fills the land when people are having this kind of sex, and it's not seen positive.
Okay, thank you.
What's another category of sex worker we have? A kadesh or kadesha. And we have a rule in Deuteronomy: no Israelite woman shall be a kadesha, okay, nor any Israelite man a kadesh. And you shall not bring the fee of a zona or the pay of a kelev, which literally means a dog. But most of the commentators, rabbis who read this sentence say that they would say kelev. The Torah really means like a man who is paid for sex, kind of the male equivalent of a zona. So you shall not bring the fee of a zona or a kelev into the house of Adonai your God in fulfillment of any vow, for both are born to Adonai your God. But there's weird things happening here, because how many kinds of sex workers are we talking about in these two lines? There's two. No Israelite woman should be a kadesha or a kadesh. Anybody hearing any words that sound sort of familiar or similar to kadesh or kadesha?
Kadosh.
Sorry?
Holy, I mean.
Kaddish.
Kaddish, you hear Kaddish, you hear that kadosh sound. Kaddish, kadosh, kedusha, same root, holy. Well, this is a whole different thing. So we know a kadesha, the kadesh, it's a man, is someone who is a sex worker, but this is a different kind of sex worker. This is not seen now. There still is a rule: Israelite women and Israelite men should not be doing this kind of sex work, but there's something about this kind of sex worker that is different from a zona, because this has an inherent tie to religiosity, to holiness, to religion. And a lot of the thinking, it's not unanimously thinking, but there's a lot of thinking that the kadesha or kadesh was a sex worker who had but in a kind of cultic sexual practice, not cult like Waco cult, but religious sexual practice. That in ancient religions, one of the ways that you would kind of connect to whatever god or goddess of that place, or that particular temple, and that particular religion, would be to engage. You can't have sex with the god. So what's the next best thing? Have sex with the priestess or priest, embodiment of that god on earth. So these would be cultic prostitutes, I think was the old-fashioned term for that, but sex workers who worked specifically at temples.
So is the prohibition? I'm sorry, I didn't like.
No, you're right.
Is the prohibition against the sex, or is it the prohibition of being in what I presume to be a non-Jewish cult? In other words, you're participating in not being Jewish, and that's the bad thing. It's not necessarily the sex. Is that correct?
I think that's a very interesting observation, Daniel. Thank you very much. As Jews, it's not that we don't think that there is a religious aspect to sex. That we don't think, it's not that as Jews we don't believe that sex is holy, that we don't believe that you can get closer to God through sex. A lot of Hasidic, Kabbalistic stuff, Zeranpim, and like, you know, mother, father, and the father figure, and you're like in between the whole thing. There's definitely a religious, holy aspect to sex as a Jew, but they don't want you doing, if that's how we're going to interpret this, and there are plenty of scholars who do, they don't want you, we don't do what other religions do. It's like got such a huge thrust of the Torah is like, we're going to do religion different than all those other people. And remember that early Jews, wasn't that you just woke up one day like, I'm going to be totally different. Everyone kind of came from Canaanite practice, from pagan practice. So it takes time to get people away from when they're, you know, their original, if they started out here, but you want to be here, kind of like you have to ease them into it. So you have to tell people, like, yes, maybe you're used to engaging with God via sex with the priestesses or priests of this area. We're not going to do that. And that's not how we do it. So you get a line, I would think it's a reasonable thing to say, as you said, like this, like, well, you don't do that. We're not going to be Kadesha, you're going to be Kadesh. Interesting, I think, though, also that they use this line, the next line, very next one, that you don't bring the fee, like, and let's say you don't bring the fee of a zonah or the pay of a kelah, the same, like, as a person who works as a zonah, or I guess the male equivalent being what they're using the term dog. Because they're supposed to have one, that you can't use those fees in order to kind of pay off, you know, your various religious obligations, your synagogue dues, so to speak, back in the day. But also, like, what does this line imply? There were Jews engaged in that kind of sex work back in the day. Okay, so probably, you know, the Torah doesn't like sex workers, right? You could look at those lines and go, wow, clearly the Torah does not like sex workers. Sex work is bad. As being a zonah is bad, being a kadesha is bad, sex workers are bad, and we don't like them, right? So that's just Bat Kohen who engages in sex work should be burned to death. Wonderful. Okay, so that seems pretty straightforward, right? Okay, well then I'm gonna bring you Tamar. Tamar, apologies, I don't know for the unbearable whiteness of being of these figures, but it was a French guy who painted this picture, and we don't have originals. So, you know, just imagine they weren't actually white. Tamar is in the Torah. Tamar, it gets married to a guy named Er. What a name. God does not like him. He's wicked, which is why God doesn't like him. And he gets killed because God doesn't like him. So following the tradition of the day, which the Torah has as a rule, is that if your husband dies and you don't have any children, it means he didn't have any children to carry on his name, his legacy. Oh my goodness. So what should you do? Well, his brother has to marry him, which sounds ooky right now, but in ancient times where women could not actually own any movable or immovable property, you didn't really have any other options. So being married off to his brother was probably a pretty good deal for you. And someone would be able to take care of you. Again, ancient times, not now, but in ancient times. And you could also like refuse. So she marries his brother. Brother's name is Onan. If that name sounds familiar, it's because he's very famous for doing what he did that got him killed by God, which is when his turn came to marry Tamar. And he did. He went, ooh, I don't want to marry her because the first kid we have is going to be my brother's kid, which is true. If the first child you had with your new husband, which is also your brother-in-law, would technically we consider to be the son of your dead husband, first husband. And he was like, ooh, I don't want to do that. And so, spoiler alert, not spoiler alert, but if you are, again, not 18 and over, I don't know, don't listen. So he would, instead of completing the sex act, he would, coitus interruptus, I think is the technical term. So he would finish on the ground instead of finishing in his wife. And God did not like that because that's not what he was supposed to do. And so he died too, which left another brother, Shelah. Now the problem with Shelah is that he was a child. And all three of these boys, their father was Judah, as in that Judah, as in like Judah from like the 12 tribes, Judah. So his youngest son is supposed to marry this woman. And he goes, ooh, I don't want my youngest son to marry this woman. She's cursed. She's killed off two of my sons. Never cursed him. Maybe they did something to the God would not be so happy. No, it must be this woman. It's all her fault. So he says to her, okay, well, my youngest son, yeah, you can marry him if you want, and you should. That's great. I'm totally in favor. But he's a boy, and so you can't marry him right now. So go back to your father's home, your hometown, your village, and wait for him to come of age. And then when he comes of age, then you can marry him. So Shelah grows up, and Judah's wife dies. That's important for the plot. And do you think that he lets his last son marry Tamar? No, he doesn't. He's like, what am I going to do? I live in an ancient society. I can't own anything ever. I can't support myself. I'm not married, but I can't be like a daughter again. So I'm left with no status and no one to take care of me and no way to take care of myself. What am I going to do? So she takes matters into her own hands. And she hears Judah is coming up her way. She lives in a different village, remember. She's coming up her way for the annual sheep shearing. Quite an event, I imagine. And this is what she does. Someone who's not me should read. My voice is not that pleasant. I sound like Fran Drescher. Anna, thanks for volunteering.
Yes. So she took off her widow's garb, covered her face with a veil, and wrapping herself up, sat down at the entrance at the crossroads. When Judah saw her, he took her for a zona, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, here, let me engage in intercourse with you. That's very enticing. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. What, she asked, will you pay for sleeping with me? He replied, I will send a kid from my flock. But she said, you must leave a pledge until you have sent it. And he said, what pledge shall I give you? She replied, your seal and cord and the staff which you carry. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she conceived by him. Then she went on her way. She took off her veil and again put on her widow's garb.
Right. So he assumes she is Zonah. She's a sex worker, not of the religious variety. And he says, okay, hey, I wanna hire you. And she goes, what are you gonna pay me? And of course he's gonna pay her because he's not a complete jerk. And he said, I'll send you some payment. And she goes, no. No, you leave something with me. It's like leaving your credit card with the bartender. No, I'm not, you're gonna come back for this. No worries. And your seal was a very specific thing to you. It was like it's like a signature. Every guy had one, and they all were distinct. These were the very important things. He definitely would come back to them. They're very distinctive to Judah. So he agrees. That seems reasonable to him. They have sex, and Torah makes sure to tell us that she gets pregnant, and then she goes back to just being herself. Questions before we go on with the story?
I guess it's just interesting that he took her for a zona, which seems, again, to change the language a little bit. I don't know if that's just a translation thing or, I don't know. It seems like that's the act rather than the person, right? The way that it's phrased here.
Yeah, I mean, he takes her to be like not a zona, like a woman who has sex for money or the equivalent, things, and not of the kind of religious variety, just kind of a common garden variety sex worker, just doing what she does. And he assumes that's who she is, but also we can kind of read into this, what's being insinuated. Like, well, we know that this is an area perhaps that's known for sex workers that are there, and also we know that she covered her face. So that's not that we got she covered herself up. There are certain clothes you wear when you're a widow. There are certain clothes you wear when you are engaged in sex work.
So is the implication that he took her for a sex worker because she has like a veil on her face, or he just didn't recognize her because of the veil on her face?
It's so interesting you say that. And I mean, we could do a whole thing just on this, but the rabbis aren't really sure when they look at this story. So, because some of them say like, oh, he didn't recognize her because she literally was veiled. And other ones are like, oh, he didn't recognize it was her because every time he had seen her prior, she had like been veiled in his presence. But like, ancient Jews don't really veil in that way. So I don't know how they would get that. But basically, there's not a huge amount of agreement. Did he not recognize her because she was veiled, or did he not recognize her because he didn't know what his daughter-in-law looked like?
Do we know what widow's garb looked like? I assume it did not have a veil and did not wrap themselves up.
I don't, in that specific time, I don't know. but it's clearly it's distinctive because the Torah makes a point of telling us she took off these clothes, she put on these clothes.
I would expect her widow's garb was much more modest than her Zona's garb.
Well, my goodness, she's wrapped in a veil and her body's wrapped up. How much more modest can you get?
It also seems like there was discussion about if she's like tricking him, right, by doing that. I'm glad that's not the discussion, but I'm just curious.
Oh.
That's coming up. Okay.
You read this one. You read this one.
Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adulamite to redeem the pledge from the woman, but he could not find her. He inquired of the council of that locale, "Where is the Kadesha, the one at Enaim by the road?" But they said, "There has been no Kadesha here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I could not find her." Moreover, the local council said, "There has been no Kadesha here." Judah said, "Let her keep them, lest we become a laughingstock. I did send her this kid, but you did not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the Zona. In fact, she is pregnant from Znut. Bring her out for trial," said Judah. "She should be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent this message to her father-in-law: "It's by the party to whom these belong that I'm pregnant." She added, "Examine them. Whose seal and cord and staff are these?" Judah recognized them and said, "She is more in the right than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he was not intimate with her again."
So did she trick him?
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's so. First of all, how does he refer when he goes to the council and he's like, "I'm looking"? He knows who he's looking for. He's looking for a Zona that he engaged for her services. What does he ask the council? These other guys, these other men, and men of status because they're on the council. What does he ask them? Who's he looking for?
A Kadesha.
A Kadesha. Interesting. And they say, "Okay, there's no Kadesha here. We don't know who you're talking about." And their friend goes back to Judah and says, "Like, I looked for her, to pay her." And they even say there hasn't even been a Kadesha there, so they don't know what you're talking about. And Judah says, "You know what? Like, let her keep my seal and my cord and my staff, whatever. Like, people are gonna, let's become a laughing stock." Interesting choice. So there is something that there is something of we don't want to tell people. So he says Kadesha instead of Zona. So there's a lot of layers to this. And he says, but at the end of the day, I tried to pay her. I wanted to pay her. I'm not a jerk, but I'm just gonna let it go. 3 months later, Judah's told, "Your daughter-in-law has played the Zona." They know it can't be from her husband, either of her husbands, because they're both long dead. And she should be burned. So we infer from this that her father is what? A Kohen. You got it. I saw you now. So I got you. Yeah. So she's being brought out for trial because Judah couldn't do anything about it in locale because he actually was in a different space. It's like a whole jurisprudence thing. His first thing is like, "Oh yeah, she should be burned." First thing he says, bring her for trial, she'd be burned. So as she's being brought out, what could she easily do with the stuff she has? She's got his seal and his cord and his staff. What would be, I don't know, a not unreasonable decision she makes in terms of how she handles the situation?
Could have just embarrassed him and just said, "Look I've got your cord, I've got your seal," but she doesn't. She lets him take the responsibility.
She'd be like, "Hey, oh, so interesting that I'm on trial. Whose is this? Who? It's so interesting. Like, whose stuff is this? That's so crazy." But she sends them to him, and she's like, "It's this person. This is like, obviously she knows who he is." And at that point, he knows who she is. And he said, and his response is so fascinating. He says, "She's more in the right than I am. She's more right than me. So kami many. She's more right, like word satka. She's more like right and righteous than I am." He said, "Because I didn't follow the rules for our current society, which is that women need to be taken care of because we don't let them take care of themselves, and there's no other way to do it. So I was supposed to marry her off to my son when he was an adult, and I didn't do it. And that's more wrong than her taking money for sex." Interesting. And then it says, keep this in your mind. There's a lot to keep in your mind, sorry, that he did not know her. He says, "Doesn't know where he came to her." Oh, and he did not know her. Did not know her. Yeah. Yada. He never knew her, which is why in rabbinical school, like, did you know her? Do you know her biblically? To know somebody is to have sex with, which is like a whole meta thing, I guess. Okay, that's the Torah. But the Torah says lots of stories that later the rabbis go, okay, but these people are actually bad. They made bad choices. They weren't good people. So the rabbis probably just say like, oh, Tamar, she pretended that she took money. She would have taken money. She's pretending to be a zonah. And she tricked her father-in-law into having sex with her. Oh my God, they must hate her. The ancient rabbis must hate her so much, so freaking much, right? Well, what happens to Tamar? We know from Tamar that she has not just one son. That's always a big deal. God doesn't just give sons to everybody, but she has two twin boys. And Tamar names the first one, kind of breaks through first, puts his arm through, and then goes, eep, puts it back in. So he breached first parts. What was it? Paratsta, not parasta alecha. What a breach you've made for yourself. She calls them parrots from paratsta. Parrots. What happens to parrots? In not even the rabbis, in the Tanakh, like we're still in the canon. Oh, let's look at Ruth. And this is the line of parrots. Parrots, he has a son named Hezron. Hezron has a son of There's like 5 generations. That person has a son named Ovid. Ovid has a son named Jesse, and Jesse has a son named David. David, as in King David, as in like the King David, as in where the messianic line comes through the house of David, like the Mashiach comes from David, who came from Paris, who came from Tamar, who pretended to be a zonah, a person who takes money for sex, or, money's equivalent. So clearly our canon not only doesn't dislike Tamar, but has venerated her, have held her up, like, look who she is. Look what she from Tamar comes the Davidic line. From Tamar comes King David.
Rabbi, this is from the book of Ruth, and we know Ruth was also an ancestor of King David. So is there a connection between Peretz and Ruth?
Yeah, obviously not Ruth, because Ruth is a Jew by choice, but through her husband, who's born Jew by birth.
Peretz and Ruth are related
by marriage.
By marriage, right? Okay.
So we're still in canon. Let's move into the Gemara, because they're going to have a whole discussion about Tamar. You'd think, okay, well, Tamar, yeah, okay, she's part of this big, long, fancy line, but like, at the end of the day, she lied to a man and pretended to be a sex worker. So what are we going to do? Who wants to read? It can't be that interesting to listen to. I really don't think that. Okay. They start off by quoting the part from Genesis, which you already read, you just saw. She sent to her father-in-law saying, by the man whose these are, am I with child? So the Gemara comments on that. And thus she says to him privately that she was impregnated by him. Anything bold is a more direct translation. Anything not bold is commentary, mostly by Rav Steinsaltz, to kind of knit things together. And Rav says, but some say Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai say, it's more amenable for a person to throw themselves into a fiery furnace if faced with the choice of publicly embarrassing another or remaining silent, even if it leads to being burned, and not humiliate another person in public. They're saying that they, as we all know, it is better for you to throw yourself into a fiery furnace than humiliate another person. It is better to be silent, even if it leads to you being burnt, than humiliate another person. And how do we learn this very important lesson, this very important value that we all know to be true? We learn it from Tamar. So they put this very important lesson that everybody knows, that they themselves hold in high esteem. They put it in Tamar's mouth, through the actions of Tamar. And what happened to her, the rabbis say? Well, remember that line, the whole, and he never knew her again, he never had sex with her again? Well, the rabbis say, and he didn't know her again. Rav Shmuel Bar Ami says, it actually means that once he knew of her, that her intentions were for the sake of heaven, he didn't desist from engaging in sexual intercourse with her again. The rabbis in the Gemara say, though the Torah says that he never had sex with her again, it's really that once he knew who she really was, he never stopped having sex with her, which the other rabbis, when they later comment on that, they say that they got married. So Tamar, a person who took on the role of a zonah, from her we get the Davidic line, from her we get King David, and Judah, according to the later rabbis, say, oh, actually, even though the Torah says he never had sex with her again, he never knew her again, the rabbis in the Gemara say, no, actually means that they got married. So romantic. What a meet cute. Okay, so that's Tamar. That's like one example. You could make the argument, okay, that's one example of one sex worker, but like all the rest of the stuff in the Torah is like, oh, you can't do it, it's so bad. Like one example doesn't really prove anything, right? It's only one example. Right. Okay, I got another one for you. This is Rachav. Slightly less white people, so that seems probably slightly more accurate. Still 19th century French guy though. This is Rachav. Background of Rachav, she is not Jewish. She lives in a city called Jericho. We are post-Moses, a guy named Joshua was in charge, and we got to take Jericho. It's like what we have to do, so we're going to be at war with them. But Joshua knows, because he's not just a leader of people, but he's also the military leader, and he knows you don't just go march into a new city without knowing what's going on there. You got to send spies. And so that's what he does. Does anyone have their beautiful voice, or are they just going to need more of my...
I'll read again if you
Thank
want.
you, Anna.
Okay. So Joshua's spies set out, and they came to the house of a zonah named Rahav and lodged there. The king of Jericho thereupon sent orders to Rahav, produce the men who came to you and entered your house, for they have come to spy out the whole country. The woman, however, had taken the two men and hidden them. It is true, she said, the men did come to me, but I didn't know where they were from. Now, since I have shown loyalty to you...
She's talking to the spies now. Sorry, I had to like ellipses it because it's just too long, but she's talking to the spies now. Continue.
Okay. Now, since I have shown loyalty to you, swear to me by Adonai that you in turn will show loyalty to my family. Provide me with a reliable sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and save us from death.
So Rachav is a non-Jewish zonah and also possibly an innkeeper. And these two spies come to her and she lies to the king about who they are. So I'm an innkeeper and the zonah. It's like obviously like a lot of guys walking through here, but like I don't know. I didn't ask people where they're from, and I'm a loyal subject in this wonderful place, Jericho. Wonderful, wonderful, so great. And she says to the two spies, like, I know that that God is with you. She's not Jewish, but she says, I don't know, like, the Jewish God, your God is with you. I know you're going to win because you're right. This is you're right. You're going to win. And so I'm going to do whatever you need to be helpful. And this is what I want in exchange for my loyalty. She says, give me a sign. You're going to spare the life. And then who does she ask about? Whose lives does she want to protect? Because you might think that especially the Torah might say, oh, a person who is engaged in sex work, they only care about themselves. They only care about, me. I only care about me. I'm number one. But that's not what the book of Joshua says. It says that this woman, who is a zonah, a non-Jewish zonah, she says, spare the lives of my father and my mother and my brothers and my sisters. And it's very rare anyone ever talks about sisters. And all who belong to them. She basically says, I want you to take care of my family. I want my family to be safe and save us from death. Not me from death, save us from death. The only time she talks about herself in terms of like what she's going to get out of this exchange is going to be what she gets along with her family. Wow. And how's it go? Joshua bade the two men. This is after, they go in. They're going to win. Hooray. Obviously, we are triumphant. Hooray. And so Joshua goes to these two men who spied on the land and says, go to the zonah's house, bring out that woman and all that belonged to her, as you swore to her. He's like, Joshua says, you got to keep your promise to the spies. And we learned that only Rachav, the zonah, the text makes a point of saying, reminding us, zonah, doesn't shy away, doesn't pretend like she's not a zonah now, that she's, everything's okay. Nope, Rachav zonah and her father's family were spared by Joshua along with all that belonged to her. And she dwelt among the Israelites, as is still the case. Interesting. For he had hidden the messengers that Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Wow. So the text of Joshua is like really pro Rahav. That's pretty cool. But again, I mean, she's a zonah, and she did great things. That was really nice what she did. But she's non-Jewish. She's a zonah. The rabbis probably don't like her all that much, right? Logically. Someone want to read? There's a little bit.
The sages taught there were 4 women of extraordinary beauty in the world: Sarah, Abigail, Rahav, and Esther. The sages taught in a Baraita. Rahav aroused thoughts of Zanut by the mere mention of her name, Yael by her voice, Abigail by remembering her, Michal, the daughter of Saul, by her appearance. Similarly, Rabbi Yitzhak said, anyone who says Rahav, Rahav immediately experiences a seminal emission. Rav Nachman said to him, I say Rahav, Rahav, and it does not affect me. Rabbi Yitzhak said to Rav Nachman, when I said this, I was specifically referring to one who knows her personally and recognizes her beauty.
So this is part of a longer section talking about these 4 of this, these 4 of that. There's a numerical theme going on there. There's 4 women of extraordinary beauty: Sarah, Abigail, Rahav, and Esther. So okay, Rahav's very beautiful. And the sages also teach in kind of a separate but related text of who arouses these thoughts of znut, which again, we would have thought, looking at the Torah text before, that is uniformly, completely, and terrible bad thing. But Rahav makes the mention of her name arouses thoughts of znut. And Yael, who again, our text loves Yael, she's a fighter, amazing, by her voice. Abigail, prophetess, just by remembering her. Michal, Saul's daughter, one of the wives, by her appearance. So clearly, znut in and of itself is not a negative thing. There might be a negative aspect, but our rabbis would never assign any quality of that to any of these women if it was a uniformly terrible thing. And then I just had to add in this other little section because it just cracked me up to read Rabbi Yitzhak saying, if you say Rahav, you immediately have a seminal emission. The other guy's like, I've never had that happen. Okay.
I swear these guys are 12.
Oh, keep that in mind as we move on through these texts because it's going to just crack you up. And just a little bit again. What else happens to Rahav? Because we love a happy ending. We love a romantic movie, a little rom-com action. They're talking more about Rahav, and they're saying 8 prophets who are also priests who descended from Rahav the Zonah. Wait, so 8 prophets. There are 8 prophets who were also priests, and they all descended from Rahav the Zonah, which the text makes a point of saying. She is a sex worker. She takes money or took money for sex, and she had 8 sons who all were prophets. And then they go further to say, because they're having a whole discussion about Huldah, who was a prophetess. They're saying, well, Huldah was Joshua's daughter. Well, maybe Huldah was Rahav's daughter. And then they tie the nice little bow. They say, well, clearly Rabbi Yehuda said, so too Huldah the prophetess, because Rahav converted and married Joshua. So the rabbis can say one thing about sex work, but also Joshua, like the guy who had an entire book of the Tanakh dedicated to him, who took over leading the Jewish people after Moses died, according to the rabbis, marries Rahav, and their children are prophets and prophetesses. Fascinating. Sometimes, though, they just kind of tell stories that are really funny. Like speaking of 12-year-olds. Here, Daniel, why don't you read this one? It's short.
Once Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi arrived at the town of Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Shimon, he said to the locals, "Does that righteous person have a son?" They said to him, "He has a son, and any Zona who hires herself out to others for 2 coins hires him for 8.
So this is my example of, besides the fact that they are perhaps 12-year-olds, that a lot of times, so they're not really saying anything negative about a zonah here. They're saying it's really just to kind of further another conversation, because the conversation they're having here is about Rabbi Elazar. And they're really just trying to say like he was either so good looking or so very good at sex that a zonah, who the rabbis always said they were very beautiful women who were very talented at sex, that they would hire him for 4 times whatever they would charge. Just mildly interesting. And yes, sometimes, I mean, I'm not gonna lie to you and say everything's like different than it actually is. Oftentimes when a zonah is being used as a plot device, it's going to be, well, as a plot device. So you have like in Hosea, God says to Hosea, go get yourself a wife of Znut and children of Znut. And because it's, like, oh, because the whole story of Hosea is like, oh, you're going to marry a woman who's going to stray from you and she's going to she's going to run away back to her other lovers because she's going to think that life is better with them, because the whole thing is really just a commentary on like, well, the Israelites, they've got it so good with me. It's so great that we're in relationship, me, God, and the people, and these Jewish people, and they're going to run away and they're going to engage with another like religious practices, and they're not going to know how good they got it, and they're going to want to come back, and I'll always take them back, but it's really hurts. So it's the zonah as a plot device. It's the zonah as a kind of parable, not a commentary on like literal sex work practiced by literal sex workers. And they like to blame Znut for other things. But again, I think they're having a conversation about something else. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, since the fall of the temple, this is part of a longer part about saying, since the temple is fallen, we don't have a temple, how horrible are things these days in the Mishnah. Since we don't have a temple anymore and there's no more temple sacrifice, all that lost purity. Because if you have a temple, you can sacrifice things, you have more purity, no temple, less purity. The lost purity has removed the taste and aroma from fruit. And the tithes that were separated, you have to separate, has removed the fat of the grain, so it's like less delicious and less nutritious. And the sages say, Znut and witchcraft have consumed it all. What does Znut and witchcraft have in common?
Women.
So I think they're talking about women and not specifically Znut. And this is just in case you're wondering how much physical distance you have to keep from a zonah. Well, luckily for you, Avodah Zarah tells you. And quoting Proverbs, which says, remove your way far from her and do not come near the entrance of her house. And they say, what does that line mean from Mishlei? Well, of course, that doesn't literally mean any of that stuff. It means other things. They say, remove your way far from her. This references heresy and the ruling authority. So stay away from, oppressive non-rulers. And do not come near the entrance of her house. This is a reference to a zonah. How much distance must you maintain from a zonah? 4 cubits. This is a cubit. So for like approximately 6 feet-ish. I mean, everyone's got a different forearm, but if you've got really short forearms, I guess that really works out for you. But again, I think ultimately they're talking about bigger shit, and this is where we're going to start talking about zima and really what is znut. This is from the Sifra, which it means it was written around the same time. It's midrash, but midrash halacha. So it's midrash, it's stories, but it's stories that really come to tell us laws as opposed to stories that are stories to teach other important things, but not the same. Rabbi Yehuda says, it is written in Yirmiyahu, which I didn't bother pulling because they gave you the whole code anyway, and you have polluted the land with your znut and with your wickedness. Okay, so those are equated. Therefore, the rain showers are withheld, and as you have a zonah's forehead, you refuse to be ashamed. You're not ashamed of your znut. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, because he, ba'an nashim arbeh, that's the Hebrew, which literally means he comes upon many women, means he has sex with many women without remembering which. Or she conceived from many men without remembering which. He may mistakenly marry his own daughter or marry her to his son so that the world is filled with mamzerim, this being the meaning zima. It is an acronym the rabbis teach for zo, mahi. This one, what is it? Zo, this one, mahi. What is it? So is it sex work specifically that bother them, or is it that you could engage in znut, a kind of sex where it's depersonalized entirely? It's sex with someone who to you isn't even a person. You don't even know their name. You don't even it almost is more about you, that you're just having sex and you don't know who they are, you don't remember about them, because what are the rabbis super concerned about? They're concerned about mamzerim. They're concerned about mamzerut, which are bastardy is how you kind of translate it, but it's not the Christian idea of your parents aren't married. Jewish, we don't care if your parents are married when you're born. It's a person who's born from incest or adultery, out of an adulterous or incestuous relationship. That is mamzerut. That produces mamzerim, because that we can never get rid of it. There's no halachic way out of it, and it's also, besides like halachically it's bad. Why is it halachically bad? Because It's bad for society for people to have adulterous relationships and incest. Ugh. So I think that's a huge part of their concern with like a depersonalized sex, that it's bad for you, like as a person, it's bad for society as a whole, it's bad for the gene pool. I think that's like their big issue. More than a lot of these other issues.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I'm glad everybody's over 18. What is the how does that translate when it comes to masturbation? Because it sounds like you could also interpret that as people who are just having sex for their own pleasure, right? For their own experience, is not a good thing. I don't know if that's the same idea, but it sounds the same.
No, for sure. I mean, this is when I like every time Jennifer can say, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. Every single time I teach anything, I'm like, this could be its own 3-part series, because it's just like how you do it. I have 10 minutes. I don't even know how I'm going to get through this. But masturbation specifically is kind of interesting and complicated, and definitely in terms of like how Judaism views it. How the ancient rabbis view it, how the system views it, also differs for men and women, because the rabbis had a real concern about kind of, why did Onan, Tamar's second husband, die? Because he spilled onto the ground, and God's like, no, not supposed to do that. And that's how some people say, like, oh, you're not supposed to masturbate, but like as a woman, like nothing to spill. So, it's, again, assuming everyone's, cisgendered, because the ancient rabbis didn't really have so much, they weren't really talking about trans issues particularly. So speaking from a very like cishet perspective. And female masturbation, I mean, the rabbis really didn't have any concept of it, which isn't hugely shocking. But there's also the case being made, like, if you're going to engage in masturbation as opposed to sex practices that are risky, like in terms of like disease, then you're never supposed to imperil your life or your health. So that's always better. Like barrier methods of contraception halachically are not permitted. Hormonal birth control is. We don't have an issue with birth control as Jews, but barrier methods like condoms or male condoms, female condoms, diaphragms, back in like the day, the sponge, I don't know, I've seen like Seinfeld once, and there's a sponge apparently. So barrier methods, the rabbis do have an issue with, because you're not supposed to interrupt the act of man, assuming it's a man and a woman, and penis vagina intercourse, and semen has to get to where it's going. But if it's pikuach nefesh, if it's a stable to keep you from getting a disease that could harm you or kill you, or then that would be allowed. But if that's not your concern, then that's a whole other conversation. Next year, when we're in the Valentine's month, I can do a whole thing on other stuff. I mean, I feel like everyone does like, Judaism is sex positive, and that's like a whole thing. Like, I don't know, I want to just be different. I want to do sex work in Judaism. So, but kind of in line with that, talking about like, what about this? So you have this impulse to have sex with a sex worker. So what do we do? What do we do with that? Is that bad? Are you a bad person? Are you doing something good? Like evil inclination. Well, Genesis Rabbah, very famous line, saying, can the evil, because it's quoting itself saying like, well, God created all these things, including the good inclination, the evil inclination. The rabbis ask, just reading at the top, can the evil inclination be very good? Like, that doesn't make sense. It's an evil inclination. How can the evil inclination be very good? God saw that it was very good. How could it have been very good? We say, well, that would be extraordinary, but without the evil inclination, this is the rabbis talking to the rabbis about rabbis, no one would ever build a house or get married or have children. There's something, so it's not that like having sex is bad or wanting to have sex is bad. It's kind of like, what do you do with that impulse? What do you do? Like, does having sex make you do bad things? Does it make you do like to other people? Does it make you do bad things to yourself? Does it make you make bad decisions? That's negative. That no Jewish source is going to say that's okay. You're not allowed to do it. But the impulse to have sex, the desire to have sex, is never inherently bad, because that's the desire that brings us children and gets, deepens relationships. That's not a bad thing. How could it be a bad thing? And it's interesting when you look at the bottom text from Kiddushin. And this is when it's really interesting, because you look at the actual words versus how it's usually interpreted. I'm just Rabbi Eli the elder says, if a person sees that their inclination is overcoming them, doesn't say what kind of yetzer, just says the yetzer. You have some kind of inclination coming over them. Go to a place where they're not known, wear all black clothes, and cover themselves in simple black garments, so baseball cap, sunglasses, and do as their heart desires. But don't desecrate the name of heaven in public. And that's meaning that you're transgressing, just doing something you're desecrating the name of heaven. Just do it in secret. If you can't overcome, so yes, they are saying that there are certain impulses that are not positive. They don't think you're good. They don't think are great for you, but they're not saying don't do them. Never do them. Never engage with this part of yourself. Like and there's plenty of things that the rabbis say are 100% no, absolutely not. Like there's never like I kind of want to murder. Well, okay, if you have to murder, no. No one's going to give you permission to murder. No one's going to give you permission to incest. No one's going to give you permission to idol worship. And anyone who engages in those things, all of our texts are going to tell you about how bad things happen to them. And there's never a middle ground. There's no like, well, maybe you no, you never murder. No one good in our tradition murders. No one good ever murders. Moses killed a guy who was in self-defense and saving someone else's life. That's not murder. That's fine. Incest, who commits incest and gets away with it and has a good life. Amnon commits incest with his sister. He doesn't live a good life. Lot's daughters, I wouldn't say that turns out super well for their families. So there are some hard lines in Judaism. Murder, incest, idol worship. But there's other things that we say, is there like ideal sexual relationships? Yes. And then there's like, practically speaking, there's just people are going to do what they do. And there's not like an all or nothing, only good, only bad, Madonna whore. We don't see that. Clearly, we've never believed that.
But the inclination that's being referred to here is essentially an erotic one.
Well, yes, I think you're reminding me. So when the people talk about what is Judaism view specifically about sex work, they usually point to this text in Kiddushin as saying like, you know what? Don't bring any kind of shame to the people. Like but there's no, is it inherently a bad thing? If it was truly morally, fundamentally evil, you would never be allowed to do it. Mm-hmm. And if there's gray area and there's wiggle room and it's an understanding that, well, maybe that actually serves a purpose. Maybe there's something to this that isn't negative, then you're given a sort of tacit permission.
Okay, can we think of I think I understand your point, but is there any other inclination other than the erotic one that this same kind of ruling applies, that you dress in black and you go where you're not known and you can go do X, Y, Z? Is there any other X, Y, Z besides the erotic inclination? Does that make sense?
It does. It's just kind of cracking me up because when I was in rabbinical school, we called it like Starbucks Gate, where I lived in like a super Jewy neighborhood. Like all the students, it's Pico Robertson in LA, extremely Jewish, and like somebody was seen going to the big there's a big Starbucks on Pico and Robertson, went into Starbucks on one of our own students, a conservative rabbinical student, went to Starbucks and bought Starbucks on Shabbat. And it was like a whole thing, like a whole thing. And it was very funny. And actually an email went out like from the school, from the dean, saying like, you know what? If you're going to go and do stuff like this, like don't do it before Hesia. Don't do it in public, which is the term that they use there. Like 3 lines down, three words in, before Hesia in public. It's like, okay, is buying stuff on Shabbat, do we want you to do it? No, because you're conservative rabbinical students who are going to be conservative rabbis. But like, is it like you're a bad person? You're going, to the non-Jewish hell, which doesn't exist. No, but just don't do it in public, which is the first thing you think of.
There is a Yiddish proverb that essentially says, if you're going to eat treif meat, like pork, let the grease glisten from your beard.
I can't say I've ever heard that, but I will trust you to know more Yiddish than I do. Yes, Richard.
Rabbi Fort, I just wonder whether Rabbi Eli the elder, when he made that statement that we're reading at the bottom of the screen, was really talking to the priests and the rabbis and the leaders of the congregation, rather than ordinary people. And one of the reasons I'm thinking about this is because I don't know that ordinary people would pay much attention to the rabbi was saying this, but if it came from another rabbi who was very respected, an elder, it would seem that this might be a way to influence the leaders, the rabbis, and other priests, Levites, to proper behavior. Or if you're going to do something, do it privately, wear black, and get the hell out of town and go 200 miles away.
Interesting. I mean, there's definitely an argument to be made for when it comes to the Gemara and Talmud and the Mishnah as well, that it's not just rabbis talking about rabbis to other rabbis, but like rabbis talking about other rabbis to the people. It's rabbis talking about rabbis to other rabbis. And this is a very it's been accused of being a very elitist text. This is a text, this is rabbis talking to other rabbis, that your kind of lay Jew wouldn't have seen this, wouldn't have had the time to study it. They were actually working real jobs as opposed to the rabbis. So it's an interesting argument to be made. I want to leave you with one last story. It's my favorite story about sex workers in the Talmud. It's kind of started this whole thing, and we are over, and I realize that, so I'm very sorry, and I'm going to talk faster than normal just because I'm going to get locked in the building. So there was an incident involving a certain man who was diligent about the mitzvah of wearing tzitzit, ritual fringes. This man heard that there was a zonah in one of the cities overseas who took 400 gold coins as her payment. Wow. So he sent her 400 gold coins as her payment and fixed a time to meet with her. And when his time arrived, he came and sat at the entrance of her house. Her maidservant entered. So she has a maidservant and she charges 400 gold coins. That is wild. Okay. And it said to her, that man who sent you 400 gold coins came and sat at the entrance. She says, let him enter, and he enters. So the Talmud is taking great pains to tell us that, to tell all of us, to tell each other, this is a very, very expensive sex worker, and she has her own servant and the whole process. He entered. She arranged 7 beds for him, 6 of silver and 1 of gold. So she's a sex worker with 7 beds. 7, I don't know how many people even had 1. She had 7, 6 of them were silver, 1 was gold. And between each and every one of their bunk beds, so like imagine just 6 silver bunk beds with like silver ladders, and then 1 more ladder of gold ladder, and then a gold bed. So just to paint a picture in your mind, again, this is rabbis telling stories about rabbis to other rabbis. Keep that in mind as we go forward. So she went up and sat naked on the top bed, and he also went up in order to sit naked across from her, like sit naked, sure. And as he's climbing, but he's not there yet. As he's climbing up, because you got your 4 tzitzit, 1, 2, 3, 4. You wear your tzitzit katans, you're wearing them all the time, and you're wearing any 4-corner garment, you're wearing 4 tzitzit. And as he's climbing, they whip around, and they smack him in the face, and he immediately drops down and he sits on the ground. And she also drops down and sits on the ground. And she said to him, I swear, by the Gappa of Rome, which is kind of like the Capitol building-ish area, is that you're like saying you're swearing by something very holy for Roman folks. I swear by the Gappa of Rome, I will not allow you to go until you tell me what defect you saw in me. Because remember, she's 7 silver beds, and then a gold bed, and then 400 gold pieces. She's a hot commodity. She's very in demand. What defect did you see in me? She says that you would not even climb all the way up. You just sit on the ground. And he said, I swear by the temple, mirroring language. I never saw a woman as beautiful as you. But there's one mitzvah that Adonai our God has commanded us, and its name is ritual fringes, tzitzit. And it's written twice. Ani Adonai Elecha, I am Adonai your God. I am Adonai your God. And it says that, so we know that, like you get punished if you're not doing what you should do, and then you get, another dog, hooray. And you get rewarded for doing what you should do. And my 4 fringes, it's like there are 4 witnesses who are going to testify against me this thing that I shouldn't do. I know I shouldn't do it, but I really wanted to do it. But I stopped when I smacked me in the face. She said to him, again, I will not allow you to go until you tell me, what is your name? What is the name of your city? What is the name of your teacher? And what is the name of the study hall in which you studied Torah? Do you really think she said all that stuff? Again, a story by rabbis to rabbis about rabbis. So, but apparently this non-Jewish, very expensive sex worker wants to know, what yeshiva do you study and who's your rabbi?
Oh.
He writes this information down so she can read, we know that, and placed it in her hand. She got up, she divided all her property. 1/3 went to the government, probably as some kind of a bribe, maybe a tax. 1/3 to the poor, because she's a generous person. And again, the Talmud's taking the time to tell us these details. That's important because they're talking to each other. They're not trying to appease other people. They're talking to each other. And 1/3 she just kind of keeps in her possession, and she keeps all those gold and silver beds. She goes to Rabbi Chia's yeshiva and she says, my teacher, instruct your students concerning me, have them make me a convert. She wants to be a Jew. And Rabbi Chia says to her, my daughter, perhaps you set your sights on one of the students. And that's why you want to convert. And she took the note that she'd gotten from that guy who did not want to engage her for her, even though he already paid her. She gives it to Rabbi Chia, and he says, go take possession of your purchase. Those beds that she arranged for him in a prohibited way, now arranged for him in a permitted fashion. And I like ending with a story because first of all, it just cracks me up that just like everything about the story, that like there's this renowned sex worker who's amazing and 400 gold coins, and then he's climbing up there to take his purchase, and he gets smacked in the face with the tzitzit and goes, oh my gosh, I can't have sex with this sex worker, and she's so impressed by him in the story by the rabbis, about the rabbis, to the rabbis, that she converts and marries him. Which again, isn't that shocking, seeing how the other stories about other zonot in our tradition kind of go, that they end up marrying real high up. So I just kind of want to end with my part, because I know we're over a lot. 7 minutes. It's pretty good for me, actually. I'm just going to end with my thing, and then everyone's going to comments and questions, whatever. Look, I'm not going to sit here and say Judaism says sex work is permitted, but I'm also not going to sit here and say that it's clearly that the Judaism say, oh, it's bad, and if you do it, you're bad. If you engage in any part of if you procure sex work, or if you engage in sex work, you're bad. Because if that was true, the Torah wouldn't waffle and the Talmud wouldn't waffle, but they clearly waffle. They say at the same time, like, yeah, we don't want you to do this, but also look at these amazing sex workers in our tradition, ancestors of the great men and people of our tradition who engaged in sex work. I think if it was like a uniformly, this is bad, this needs to be condemned thing, it would be, because our tradition has no problem saying that some things are uniformly bad and evil: murder, incest, idol worship, etc. But our tradition also recognizes that sex and wanting to have sex is a very human impulse, and there's a time and a place for it, and there's healthier and less healthy ways of engaging in it. And they often use the character of a zonah to teach other lessons. They have other concerns. Some very practical, parentage and marrying people you're like literally related to, and to just talk about is a kind of a metaphor. So I think it's complicated, and I recognize that our tradition recognizes that. And fun fact, sex work is legal in Israel. So I'm going to be done, because I want to be respectful of time. 10 minutes after is not bad for me. And the next session, next month is astrology in Judaism. Very rich. I'm really going to try to get through it in an hour. Hope for the best. Pray for me. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to stay and ask. I'll stay as long as I don't get trapped in the building. So, thank you. You can stay and ask questions if you have any questions. Thanks for coming. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks for coming. Feel free to come for astrology next month.
Thank you
Thank
for
you, Rabbi.
leaving
Thanks
this
for coming.
open to family and stuff like that. Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you.
Stop sharing. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
I was curious to know if there is discussion about sex work origins, or how it is, there are examples of the effectiveness from a past tense sense, but I guess I'm wondering if there's commentary on the first people to take on sex work as any type of like survivalist, or if there was notation from God to do so.
So there's definitely, I'm trying to think of the earliest, and that's the part that's tripping. There's definitely talk in later texts about Jews engaging in sex work as kind of a, out of survival, either because of lack of funds or because you're being taken over by another, colonizer, or taken over by other people, and you're like, okay, we have to deal with the situation. And it's. I'm trying to think. You mean you want like a year? I have to get back to you if it's a year.
No, not necessarily year, but if there's commentary on, I guess the like divinity of sex work coming through as like a sign or a means, or, was it very earthly, like, oh no, we're being taken over, or was it also something, because of the talk of kind of like, the priest and the priestesses, mm-hmm. right, engaging in sex work. Is there any text about, that kind of divinity or that aspect of divinity?
It's interesting because in the Torah you see talk about non-Jewish women who are like, when the instruction is given, and I didn't put it because this is already too long, about, the instruction to us as Jews, like when you go and you take over a place and, you're going to take over non-Jewish land and there'll be non-Jews in it. And what do you do with the women? Because your first inclination, with very few exceptions, is to, kill off women and children. And what do you do with the women? And the answer is like, you can't just, like, there is a way you take care of women in that situation. And there's a certain humanity you have to have for them, even though they're not Jewish. You think like, oh, we could just do whatever we want with these women, but you're not allowed. You have to provide for them. And if you take them as wives and engage with them sexually, you can't just like get rid of them, because this is ancient society and a woman can never take care of herself after she's been kind of used like that. Like, you have to take care of her. You can't divorce her. That's it. So it's interesting. There's nothing really about Jews, but there's stuff about non-Jews and kind of how, like, when situations force you into less ideal circumstances, how there's still a minimum standard of care and civility and humanity in people who are being forced to make choices, but not for Jews. Interesting. I'll have to think about that more.
And then is there overlap with that too? Priests and priestesses who were having sacred sex, this was being observed by Jews? This was not a part of a Jewish practice? This would just be like, oh, in our observations of other cultures, this is what it is that's going on? Or was there, teachings specifically for what would be considered priests or priestesses of Judaism that was like, oh, okay, well, this and this and this?
So there definitely were not, there was not an aspect to any kind of priest of sex work to any of the priestly class, but I really, the Torah is, if it's nothing else, it's about trying to like really drag ancient Jews who were racially just Canaanites, who kind of we're going to be different now, away from Canaanite practice. However, if you scoot forward a couple thousand years and you look at the work of the Kabbalists, like the mystics, specifically the Middle Eastern mysticism versus kind of like European mysticism, picked up a lot from Christianity, so it's very like about sex. Shocking. But the mysticism that was more rooted in the Middle East, there is, and I'm like, I'm reaching back to like rabbinical school now, but it's first of all, it's all very sexual. Very sexual, and because there's definitely an underlying idea that the way you connect, but the way that not just for priests and priestesses, the way anybody can connect to God is through sex. And because it's kind of like, which makes sense in kind of a way, like how did the world, kind of this idea of like, how did the world come to be? It's because you have kind of like it's very like Zoroastrian. Like you have this, like these two figures, a male energy figure and a female energy figure, and it's through sex. And which makes sense because how do we make any kind of novel creation in the world? Sex. That's how babies get here. So like it must be sex is what created. So there's kind of there's like this really interesting weird stuff about, you know, what's like when you're like these two the male and female figures are having sex, and you're kind of like there with them, and then when you have sex you are engaging in this kind of like holy sexual act on which like the whole of creation hinges. So sex becomes sexual but also becomes very holy, and it's some really deep Kabbalistic text, and I'm not 40 yet, so I can't study, which is my way of saying I don't know it yet.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah, anytime. Maybe that'll be next year's class. The sexy, holy sex of Judaism. Any other questions before I get locked in the building? You can email me. My email's on the website or Facebook or whatever.
No more questions. Just thank you.
Sure. Anyone else? Good. Astrology next month, whatever date Jennifer sends out.
I'm good. Awesome. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.